in a hotel with his 3 brothers and mother for the last several months because they lost their house, and she is a teacher in our state. He drives to Chick-fil-A to catch the Wi-Fi so he can upload assignments at night after he gets off work because, you know, we're a 1-to-1 district and technology is important. And that after days that he has sat in 5 AP classes because he is trying to make sure that his mother doesn't have to worry about loans and that he's ready for school. In June, when he leaves me, he is going to Marine boot camp because, again, he's got to make sure that there is money for his brothers when they come up through. At the start of May, his AP portfolio was to be submitted electronically. We learned the next day that it did not upload properly, some failure of the Wi-Fi system. The college board was truly sorry that they would not be able to do anything to help him, though they could see that he had made an upload attempt and trusted that he was telling the truth. He stood in front of me, lips pressed together, trying to maintain composure because he's 18 and a man now, and he thinks that means he can't cry. "Miss Walker," he said, "I'm tired now." I wanted to reassure him. I wanted to tell him that the world is one big community that wants its young people to succeed because it's invested in him. But I couldn't find the words to say that because I'm just not sure it's true. Because I listen when the state talks about educational investment, and I am not at all convinced that we mean the same thing. State law requires that per student funding for public schools be $2,959 for the 2018-2019 budget. And yet, the amount we spend per student is $2,485. Now, that's a difference of $474 per child, which doesn't sound like a huge amount of money until you think about the fact that there are 781,493 students in South Carolina's public schools. So that becomes then a shortage of a little over $370 million every single year. If you're like me and you cannot even conceptualize what $10,000 in cash would look like, $370 million seems astounding. But here's what $370 million could mean. It could mean buses that don't catch fire, as was the case in March 18th of this year, when a bus carrying kindergartners on a field trip to a local wilderness camp caught fire, endangering our students and our chaperones. $370 million might also look like enough counselors and social workers and mental health professionals and psychologists working in our schools. Currently, the National School Counseling Association recommends a ratio of 1 school counselor per 250 students, K through 5. But our state has instead mandated 1 school counselor per 800 students. That makes it physically impossible for those people to serve the needs of everyone on their caseload. $370 million might mean enough teachers on staff to make the 14-to-1 ratio that some of our politicians love to quote a reality, instead of the current 34 biology students crammed into a classroom down the hall from me with only 27 desks and materials that ran out in March. But they need to take an end-of-course test. The lack of true investment in our schools is damaging enough. But when you couple that with a campaign of false narratives, it creates a system where the people working incredibly hard on behalf of our children and families and communities feel like they are failing when they never had the chance to succeed. Time and again, they gaslight our state when elected officials say things like, "We're adding career counselors to address counseling needs." That is an intentional misunderstanding of that dire need. When suicide is the second leading cause of death amongst 10 to 19-year-old children, they do not need career counselors. They need help. Sorry. And that was reported by the CDC in 2017, just in case we need to fact check. When elected officials provide quotes to local newspapers pondering openly how to connect with the disconnected population with no interest in having a job, it relieves them of the culpability for underfunding schools and the myriad of ways that whole communities are impacted by those decisions. Framing students as hopelessly deficit instead of honoring their funds of knowledge is a calculated action designed to promote the false narrative of lazy people who could have a job if only they were interested in having a job. Instead of people who have been left without the specialized skills or opportunity or childcare or transportation, whatever is needed as a direct result of decades of underfunding education and what that does to our communities. Ryan and Tiara, who I opened with, are both exceptional students, and they have fought for everything they've earned. But I won't be complicit with the false narrative of elected officials that if they hadn't made such an extraordinary effort, that they would somehow be a failure. Nor will I allow myself to accept the false narrative that I am or could ever be a failure provided all that I do for my students within a system that year after year, decade after decade, failed to fully fund them. When they graduate next month, they will never have spent a single day having been funded at the level guaranteed them by our EFA and reaffirmed by the state Supreme Court in the Abbeville decision. They are tired. And I know that you are tired, but we can change that. We must change that because the world our children will build is the true return on the investment that we all must commit to making. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Lakeisha Fersner Lawrence.
Good morning. Oh, we can do better than that. It's a beautiful morning in Orangeburg. I'm an Orangeburger. It is indeed an honor to be here today. My name is Lakeisha Fersner Lawrence, and I am proud to be an educator. Serving as an educator has been my passion for the last 23 years. Preparing our youth with a quality education is an important investment that will have a lifelong return. Why do I think education is important? John F. Kennedy said, "Children are the world's most valuable resource and its best hope for the future." My parents must have known this because they were adamant about making sure my 7 siblings and I graduated from high school and received a college education. You see, in our household, education was a non-negotiable. It was amazing to see my father, a farmer, and my mother, a homemaker, made certain that their children were able to receive something they were not afforded to have. Yeah. For that, I'm truly grateful. It was almost inevitable for me to begin my career as a teacher. When I was a little girl, I remember playing school on my front porch every summer. I would be the teacher, and my friends were my students. I've always loved children. I became an auntie at the age of 6. As the youngest in my family, I automatically became the babysitter. This was my start to becoming a positive influence on children. So now let's fast forward to college. When I completed my undergraduate degree in elementary education, I decided to continue my master's degree in counselor education. My logic, getting my certification in counseling would help me to better understand and help my students socially and emotionally when I would begin to teach. It also helped to boost my salary during my first year of teaching. It was no surprise that teaching was not one of those careers where I was going to be rich. But this was my mission, and I knew I was meant to be in this profession. I loved every moment of my teaching career. I loved being a guidance counselor. For the past 5 years, I have had the privilege of working with a special group of young people. As a dropout prevention coordinator, I have been able to provide opportunities for overaged and dropout students to get back on track to help them graduate from high school. Many of my students have experienced unfavorable life circumstances. I've had students who were homeless. I've had students who had to work and go to school. Some of my students were mothers who had to take care of their children and themselves. Graduation was definitely a means to an end. My job was to give them hope and the tools to be successful, to make it against the odds. Seeing them walk across that stage at their graduation was priceless. I see the fruits of my labor. Something that would really make my heart happy is to see all of my students having the opportunity to go to college. Yes, I can prepare them to be college ready, but the truth is, college is not affordable for those who don't earn scholarships or receive other forms of assistance. I know this personally because I just completed my 3rd degree last Friday, and the student loans are waiting. I remember hearing Senator Sanders' idea about the government providing free tuition to every child in America. Now, how awesome would that be? Think about the impact it would make on student success and our nation as a whole. Thousands of teachers across our nation can probably relate to what I've shared with you. They have their own stories about the journeys of becoming a teacher and their student successes. While there are many moments of celebration, there are also many unfavorable circumstances in our educational system. We all know the changes are definitely needed. The question is, where do we begin? One major concern is funding. I believe that if we don't invest now, we will pay later. I used to have a t-shirt that said, "Teachers make all professions possible." Do you believe that? It's a true statement. All of us in this room probably would not be where we are today if it were not for teachers. So why are we not valuing them? Teachers deserve better salaries. They deserve necessary resources to teach, as well as a solid support system that will help keep them in the profession. There are other issues that need to be addressed in education. Of course there are. We have teacher shortages. We have classroom sizes too large, too many standardized tests, the need for mental health counselors and social workers. The list goes on and on. Thinking about it can become overwhelming, but I prefer to accentuate the positive. It is my hope that our educational system will provide the necessary resources to prepare all children for the 21st century and beyond. Change is inevitable, and the time for change is now. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage member of the Democratic National Committee for South Carolina, Representative Gilda Cobb-Hunter.
What about, okay. Let me try that again. Hey, y'all. Listen, I'm Gilda Cobb-Hunter. I'm a member of the South Carolina House of Representatives. I'm also a member of the Democratic National Committee, something called the National Black Caucus of State Legislators. I said all of that because I think it's important For those of you who know me, I had an interesting conversation with Dr. Leggett as I was coming in, and I just feel compelled as a result to say for the record, since South Carolina was fortunate enough years ago to win the First in the South primary, I have chosen not to endorse candidates. And so I'm here simply to welcome Senator Sanders and his team to Orangeburg County. But because I've got so many hats, I also want to take this opportunity to mention a couple of things to you that I think are important. Now, y'all gonna have to get a little more fire or something in you before the senator comes. I know we're talking about education. Allow me, please, to give it up for these two ladies back here. You did good. Now, listen, I don't know how many of you saw the rally that the South Carolina for Ed did at the State House a few weeks ago. I have never, in the years I have been in the legislature, seen over 10,000 people on the State House grounds. Y'all, that's worth another clap. Now, wake up in here. Here's what here's the message that I want to leave with you. I am not one of these Democrats who believe we have too many people running. I think we have an opportunity this time around to really focus, talk about issues. We've had two examples up here of people who are struggling in our classroom, trying to educate children in this state in spite of the South Carolina General Assembly. We need to make sure, Madam Teachers, I am hopeful, along with my colleague Justin Bamberg, I am sure, we hope and pray that the teachers will stay woke. It was impressive to see that number, but you need to understand, change doesn't happen without struggle. And I know Dr. West is going to talk about all that, but my point to you is this. Just as has been happening in other communities, in other areas, we need you to get off your butt and run for office. We need you to stop complaining about things without putting some effort into change. I know most of you, if not all of you in here, are Bernie supporters, and I congratulate you on choosing a candidate who is speaking to the issues. We need more of that. What I want to leave you with, though, is that this business is serious. What this number 45 has done to this country, it's kind of like termites eating away, and you never see the real damage until it's almost too late. Well, we've got a termite in the what? We've got termites in the government, and we need to stay focused. So regardless, I'm hopeful that whoever winds up being the nominee of the Democratic Party, that we will all join hands, work hard, and make sure that that nominee becomes number 46. There's a lot riding on it. There's a lot riding on it. And so let me leave you with this. Get out, work hard, register voters, have conversations about Senator Sanders and his policies, do all that you want to do, that you need to do, that you know needs doing. But we can't stop until after November 2020 and make sure that we have elected people, not just at the top, but not just at the Congress. Newsflash, there's something called devolution, and the power is at the state level. So we need you to help. Justin and I need help in the South Carolina legislature. I encourage you to get busy. Don't agonize, organize. Thank you so much. Welcome to Orangeburg. Appreciate it.
Please welcome to the stage Dr. Cornell West.
What an honor, what a privilege, and what a blessing to be in historic Orangeburg, South Carolina. Let us be very clear that this city is historic ground. Blood, sweat, tears, love, unbelievable determination. And to be here to be able to introduce my dear brother Bernie Sanders. Oh yes, visionary. When I look at my dear brother Justin, I see a visionary. When I look at Sister Nicole, I see a visionary. When I look at Sister Lakeisha, I see a visionary. When I look at my sister Gilda, I see a visionary. Give it up for visionaries. You all know the motto of Claflin University is the world needs visionaries. And somewhere I read, where there is no vision, the people perish. And let us never forget the Orangeburg Massacre. 23 precious folk injured. 3 precious brothers, Brother Henry, Delano, and Samuel. Killed. That's 2 years before Kent State, 2 years before Jackson State, 2 months before Brother Martin was taken. That this campaign is just no ordinary campaign now. It's about vision, service to the least of these, and sacrifice willing to accent those who have been cast as the wretched of the earth. And it's true, we got a whole lot of candidates out there, and it's a good thing to have a choice. But you have to be able to discern between those Ashford and Simpson called the real thing and those copies and imitations who's saying what he was saying 4 years ago and act as if they just found their conviction now. Let's just keep it real. We love all of them. They all human beings, and I'm a Christian. They made in the image of God, but we got to be able to make judgments that focus on precious and priceless young folk of all colors, but disproportionately chocolate catching hell, not just in South Carolina, but around the country. That's why Brother Bernie Sanders is no ordinary candidate. He went to jail in 1963. That's not a joke. That's not something to laugh at. 1963, you could get killed. And if you a vanilla brother siding with black people, a lot of your white brothers and sisters said, you must be crazy. But I understand that those folk who are part of the love train, I'm talking about the love warriors. I'm not talking about these sunshine soldiers. Show up when the sun's out. I'm talking about in the rain and the storm. When the winds are blowing and the clouds are in place. That's where you find out who's for real. That's what integrity is. That's what consistency is. We're not talking about perfection. We're not talking about purity. We're talking about folk who have decided based on their calling that they're going to be, in the language of John Coltrane, a force for good. And of course, South Carolina, y'all produced Dizzy Gillespie, so that's just a moment of silence for me. Because when you talk about education, you're not just talking about skill acquisition and information. You're talking about transformation. You're talking about awakening. That's what Robert Smalls had in mind when he emerged out of South Carolina with the first vision of a free compulsory public school system in the history of America. That's a black man from South Carolina with that vision. That's what we're talking about. And if he came back from the grave and said, how are my precious children doing of all colors in South Carolina? There would be tears flowing from his eyes. And I'm not just talking about the wealthy side of town. The well-to-do doing well with their kids. Those kids are precious too. But you know what? The poor kids are just as precious as the rich kids in South Carolina, in America, in the world. And that's why Bernie Sanders is not just any ordinary candidate. And that's why I'm blessed, because I know you're here to hear him, not me. Oh, no. Sister Nina knows. Nina Turner, I love you so. Good God Almighty, you have a love warrior. Put a smile on Nina Simone's face, Fannie Lou Hamer's face. Y'all know Cassandra Maxwell Burney, first black woman, passed the South Carolina bar, education. You know Benjamin Payton, president of Tuskegee for almost 30 years from Orangeburg. You know Eugene Robinson of the Washington Post, he's from Orangeburg. We can go on, and Orangeburg's no ordinary place. But we here to talk about education. Education's got three pillars: formation of attention, the cultivation of a critical consciousness, and the maturation of a loving soul. How do you tend to get the young folk to attend to the things that matter? And you got to have resources. You got to have teachers who care. You got to have politicians with a vision. How do you cultivate their critical consciousness so they think for themselves and not just follow the crowd? How do you maturate their souls so they don't end up just smart and rich rather than wise and willing to serve somebody? Three pillars. That's what we see in our dear brother Bernie Sanders. And I introduce to you and present to others the one and only my brother Bernie Sanders with a vision of education for South Carolina, a vision for America. He's been at it for decades and decades and decades, and he's still going strong.
All right. How do I follow that, huh? It's my story of my life. I always have to follow Dr. West. And I wanted to thank all of you for being here in Orangeburg today to discuss, as I think you have heard from the previous speakers, one of the major issues facing our country. And I want to thank the many tens of thousands of people who are watching this event live stream. And I want to thank my good friend, Representative Justin Bamberg, for his remarks and for the great work he's doing. I want to thank Nicole Walker and Lakeisha Fersner Lawrence for not only being great educators, but for standing up and fighting for the kids of South Carolina and America. And I want to thank Representative Gilda Cobb Hunter for her years and years of extraordinary service to the people of this state and for the people of this country. And what can I say about my brother Cornel West, who has for so many years been one of the intellectual giants in our country, and he has inspired young people from coast to coast. Dr. West, thank you so much for what you're doing. Well, let me get to the point, and that is to say that today we are talking about an issue that needs very serious discussion because it impacts millions and millions of families in America, and that is the need to revolutionize national priorities and start giving education in this country the attention and the resources that it needs. That's what we're discussing today. It has been said today, and it has been said a million times, that the future of our country is in our children. All right? And I get a little bit tired of hearing people tell me how much they love America, but apparently they don't love the children of America. I don't understand that. And by the way, if you love America, you don't allow a situation to continue where we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth. That's not loving America. Now, as everybody knows, 65 years ago yesterday, the Supreme Court announced its landmark decision in the enormously historically important case of Brown versus Board of Education, a decision that determined that separate school systems for African Americans and whites was inherently unequal. What many across this country today are not aware of, but I am sure that the people of South Carolina know, is that this historic case was launched 40 miles down the road from here in Somerton, South Carolina in 1947. Am I right about that? At that time, South Carolina was in full segregation mode and explicitly outlawed black and white children from attending the same school. If you can believe this, at that time, the South Carolina Constitution literally said that when it came to black and white children, quote, no child of either race shall ever be permitted to attend a school provided for children of the other race, end of quote. This was justified under the separate but equal doctrine. But as we all know, the equal part was a complete sham. When black families in Somerton asked the school district to provide the same bus transportation for their kids as was provided for white children, the school district refused and the families filed a lawsuit. That case ultimately became a part of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which ended the government's official support for school segregation by declaring that the idea of separate but equal was unconstitutional. Those courageous families here in South Carolina were represented in that case by a lawyer from the NAACP, a man by the name of Thurgood Marshall. As you all know, Marshall would eventually go on to become the first African American Supreme Court justice and one of the great Supreme Court justices in the history of the United States. Thurgood Marshall's core belief was pretty simple, not complicated. He believed that it is, and I quote, the right of all of our children, whatever their race, to an equal start in life and to an equal opportunity to reach their full potential as citizens, end of quote. I agree with what Thurgood Marshall said. And in my view, the only way to accomplish that goal is to guarantee every person in our country a quality education as a fundamental human right, regardless of their income. Regardless of their income, regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of their gender, regardless of their religion, regardless of their sexual orientation. This is not a radical idea. This is the idea that America is supposed to be about. And this is an idea that impacted me very personally, as you may know, like many other Americans. I am the son of an immigrant who came to this country not speaking a word of English and without a nickel in his pocket. Over the years, our family never made much money. I lived in a rent-controlled apartment in Brooklyn, New York for my entire childhood. But I was still lucky enough to get a very good public school education. All right? That is what public education did for me. It did for all of us. And I am here to say that the kind of public school education that I and my friends received can and must be a right for every child in the United States of America. That's what we're fighting for. And let me be as clear as I can be. The United States, as you all know, is the wealthiest country in the history of the world. And whenever we talk about these issues, never forget that. We're not a poor country. We're the wealthiest country in the history of the world. And there is absolutely no reason why we should not have the best educational system in the world. No reason at all. But sadly, as you have heard from our speakers already, you all know that that is far from the case today. And here is the really bad news, and we cannot go forward unless we deal with reality as it is. We can't push this stuff underneath the rug. And the really bad news is that our nation, in fact, used to lead the world in the percentage of young Americans with college degrees. You all know that? We were number 1. Today, we are number 11. The United States of America used to be number 1 in terms of the percentage of young Americans with college degrees. Today, we are number 11, behind countries like South Korea, Japan, Canada, Ireland, the United Kingdom, and Australia. And that, to me, is not acceptable. Here in South Carolina, and I have to tell you, I didn't know this until very recently. You did, I didn't. Here in South Carolina, the standard for education, according to the state Supreme Court, is only that children get a, quote, minimally adequate education, end quote. This is America. This is the year 2019, and the doctrine out there is a minimally adequate education. What world are these people living in? How disgraceful is that? Well, I don't believe there is any parent in this room or any parent in this country who thinks that getting a minimally adequate education is acceptable for their kids. The people in South Carolina, people in Vermont, and all over this country want their kids and their grandkids, and I have 7 beautiful grandchildren, to get an excellent education, not a minimally adequate education. And working together, and what today is about is exactly what we are going to accomplish. Don't tell me we cannot do that. Yes, we can have the best educational system in the world. There is currently no state in this country, including my state of Vermont, where the educational system is where we want it to be. Trust me, in Vermont, we have our issues and our problems. But I would be negligent if I did not mention that here in South Carolina, the 2018 graduating class placed nearly last in the nation on college preparedness tests. Last year, just 2% of black students and only a fifth, 20% of white students, met the college-ready benchmark in every subject. That is just not acceptable. Not acceptable. Not acceptable for this nation, not acceptable for this state. Some want to blame the children, some want to blame the parents, and some want to blame the teachers for this crisis. I disagree. The fault does not lie with our families or our teachers. The fault fundamentally lies with decades upon decades of policies driven by government inaction, driven by racism, and driven by neglect. Year after year, decade after decade, we have seen mostly, but not all, Republicans in Washington, D.C., and in state capitals all over this country make savage cuts to public education and sharply reduce educational opportunities for low-income students, students of color, and students with disabilities, while at the same time passing huge tax breaks for the wealthiest people in this country and the largest corporations in this country. And what today is about is that the time is long overdue for this country to get its priorities right. Billionaires do not need more tax breaks. The children of our country need quality education. Further, year after year, decade after decade, we have seen right-wing judges nullify and end the oversight of court-ordered desegregation plans. Unbelievably, and this, again, is quite unbelievable, as part of the ultra-conservative attack on public education, more than 24 of Donald Trump's judicial nominees have refused to say that they would support the original Brown versus Board of Education decision. Can you believe that? It really is incomprehensible. Meanwhile, the state of our education system is falling further and further behind other countries. Today, out of 35 major countries throughout the world, the U.S. ranks 30th in math, 24th in reading, and 19th in science. And because far too many of our schools are becoming resegregated, if you are a student of color, the chances are your math, science, and reading scores are even lower. And on that note, let me just say this, and I've said it for so many years. It is a lot cheaper to send our kids to great universities than to lock them up in jail. And if anyone thinks that this issue is not connected to the fact that we have more people in jail than any other country on earth, if you don't understand that, you don't understand much about what's going on in America. And as we have heard earlier from our speakers, in the 21st century, a free public education system that goes from kindergarten through high school is no longer good enough. If we are to become the nation that we must become and that we will become, we must make public colleges and universities tuition free. And we must substantially, underline, substantially reduce student debt. I go all over the country, just talked to a young man today, paying off student debt for decades. Getting a higher education should not be a crime, something that you have to pay for decades. We want our young people to get that education. Furthermore, and again, nobody disagrees with this except the people who have the power in Washington. Who does not understand what every psychologist, child psychologist tells us? And that is 0 through 4 are the most important years of human intellectual and emotional development. Everybody knows that. And yet in America, we have a totally dysfunctional child care system where working families cannot find quality, affordable child care, and where child care workers are paid outrageously low salaries. So if we love our children, yeah, we're going to invest in universal, quality, affordable child care for every family in America. Not a radical idea. Not a radical idea. And as we go forward in revolutionizing education in America and giving it the status that it deserves, we must understand that teaching is one of the most important professions in this country. And that teachers must be honored and respected. So if we are a nation that can provide contracts to baseball players for hundreds of millions of dollars, don't tell me we cannot pay teachers in this country the kind of wages and salaries they deserve. And this, again, is part of the revolution, is to say, of course, education is important. And if education is important, then the people who do the educating are important. In fact, they are doing some of the most important work in this country. And I got to tell you, it saddens me, and it should sadden every person in this country, that we have bright young people who should be going into education, but they're looking around them and saying, no, I don't want to do that. I can't make a salary to raise my family on. We want the best and the brightest to be involved in education. And that's what the policies I'm talking about today will do. And on a sense of personal note, I really want to applaud the teachers in South Carolina, the teachers in Vermont, and teachers all over this country, especially in so-called conservative states, who have stood up and marched on their state capitals and have been the leaders in fighting for their kids in terms of improving public schools, reducing class sizes, and providing every student in their classroom with books, computers, and safe, high-quality schools. What encourages me, and you stop and you think, again, when you step outside of the box and you look at it, how does it happen that in America teachers who are poorly paid have to take money out of their own pockets to buy basic school equipment for their children? How insane is that? What encourages me and gives me so much hope about the future is, in fact, the courage that we have seen in West Virginia, in Oklahoma, all over the states, South Carolina, North Carolina, Vermont, teachers standing up for their kids. And I thank them very, very much, because they're not doing it for themselves. They are doing it for the future of this country. As all of you know, in America today, our teachers are paid the lowest salaries of nearly any major country on earth. And it is clear that we have our national priorities backwards when in this country, listen to this, the 25 top hedge fund managers on Wall Street make more money than all of the kindergarten teachers in America combined. Who's doing more important work than kindergarten teachers? You got 130,000 of them, and you got 25 hedge fund managers making more money, double the amount of money that kindergarten teachers want. There is something profoundly wrong when billionaires receive tax breaks while children go to school in this country in overcrowded, understaffed, and underfunded classrooms. We all know that. We have become used to that. But our job is to stand up in outrage and say that this is the future of our children. These are the kids that we love. We will not tolerate these absurdities. Over the past year, tens of thousands of teachers across our country have gone on strike to demand greater investments in public education. In state after state, teachers are fighting and in some cases winning increased funding for public education after decades of austerity and neglect, and I thank them from the bottom of my heart for their efforts. The wave of teacher strikes throughout the country provides an historic opportunity to make the investments we desperately need to make our public education system the best in the industrialized world, not one of the worst. And today I am very proud to introduce my Thurgood Marshall Plan for a quality public education for all. And my plan addresses the serious crisis in our educational system by reducing racial and economic segregation in our public schools, make sure we attract the best and brightest young people to become teachers, reestablishes a positive learning environment for children in our K-12 schools. In other words, this plan calls for a transformative investment in our children, our teachers, and our schools, and a fundamental rethinking of the unjust and inequitable funding of our public education system. Let me deal with educational segregation. Sadly, 65 years after Brown versus Board of Education, many U.S. schools remain segregated. Since the late 1980s, the number of racially segregated schools has more than tripled. And today, more than a third of all African American and Latino students attend a school where 90% of their peers are non-white. This segregation also operates along class lines, economic lines. 40% of children from low-income families attend schools whose student population has poverty rates of 75% or higher. So it's not just racial segregation, it is economic segregation as well. This racial and economic segregation hasn't happened by accident. It is the direct result of policy decisions made in the courts, in state legislatures, and in Washington, D.C. In America today, some 300 school districts are currently under desegregation orders, but the Supreme Court has curtailed the government's power to address them. Thanks to Betsy DeVos, just what I was going to say. The worst Secretary of Education in the modern history of our country. The U.S. Department of Education has outrageously scaled back civil rights investigations and dismissed hundreds of them. We need a Secretary of Education who is a fierce advocate for public education and for working class children, black and white, Latino, Native American, Asian American, and who works to integrate our schools, not who is doing everything in her power to undermine public education in this country. Students in integrated schools have better test scores, are more likely to attend college, and drop out of high school at lower rates. We also know that segregated schools in black and Latino areas often do not receive equal funding. Don't forget that. In 2016, school districts serving mostly students of color received $23 billion less in funding than mostly white schools, even though they served the same total number of students. In all, school districts serving the largest populations of black, Latino, or Native American students receive roughly $1,800 less per student in state and local funding than those serving the fewest students of color. There is a similar divide by income. School districts with the highest rates of poverty received about $1,000 less per student in state and local funding than those with the lowest rates of poverty. All of that has got to change. if we believe that segregation is per se inequality, we cannot tolerate separate and unequal schools, not in the United States of America and not in the year 2019. So, when we are in the White House together, we're going to create a national minimum that must be spent per pupil to educate our children. No matter where you live, no matter whether your community's property values are high or low, your kids' schools will be guaranteed a certain minimal level of education funding. We're going to start reinvesting in the federal programs that support the efforts of local school districts to better integrate their schools. We're going to triple funding for the Title I program, the major federal program that targets resources to high poverty school districts. We are going to help local school districts by making sure the federal government fulfills its promise to kids with special needs. Kids with special needs. By providing at least 50% of funding for special education and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. As your president, I will appoint judges who uphold rather than overturn desegregation orders. And I will prohibit the Department of Education from dismissing civil rights complaints. And now let me tell you what we are not going to do. We are not going to do what Donald Trump and Betsy DeVos are proposing. We are not going to propose spending $500 million to expand charter schools. Which has only increased, as you may know, educational inequality in America. Charter schools are privately run schools subsidized by public money. This is not a private school. If you want to take money out of your own pocket and send you to a private school, that's one thing. But these are privately run schools subsidized by your tax dollars. They were originally created to supplement the traditional public education system and experiment with new teaching methods. But Wall Street executives, Silicon Valley CEOs, and billionaires like Secretary DeVos and the Walton family have been using charter schools as a way to privatize the public education system, take money out of public schools, and bust teachers' unions. They have poured tens of millions of dollars into school board and other local elections to promote charter schools and end community control of local schools. And they don't care if their efforts are actually making the system more unequal and more unfair. Now, some will argue that even with their flaws, charter schools are effective because they deliver excellent educational results. And it is true that some charter schools do produce decent results. Not all charter schools are bad. But far too many charter schools in America are performing worse, much worse, than public schools. For example, in Betsy DeVos's home state of Michigan, where she fought for and won a huge expansion in charter schools, 80% of charter schools perform below the state average in math and reading. Even advocates for charter schools have described Michigan charter schools as a national embarrassment. Meanwhile, in state after state, we have been hearing about how charter schools are being used to enrich private investors and real estate developers with taxpayer money. Taxpayer money should not be going to make Wall Street operatives even richer. The NAACP has been leading the effort in the demand for a ban on for-profit charter schools and a moratorium on federal funding of new charter schools until we can ensure that they are operating with transparency and accountability. I agree with the NAACP. And as president, I will institute that ban and implement that moratorium. We are going to make sure that charter schools face the same oversight and transparency requirements as do public schools. The NAACP is right, and that is the direction that we should be moving in. We are going to restrict the pay of charter school CEOs so that public money is supporting students and not subsidizing huge payments to a handful of executives. And we are going to make sure that charter schools respect their employees and make it easier, not harder, for their employees to join a union if that's what they want. And when we talk about teachers, we must understand that there is a whole other crisis unfolding inside our schools. A recent poll showed that Americans strongly support the teachers in their local schools and understand that teachers are absolutely vital to our communities. For all the bashing of teachers and teachers' unions that we have seen in the media and in politics, the American people love their teachers, and all of us should. Teachers are, in fact, the anchors of our communities. But let us be clear. For far too long, we as a society have been vastly underpaying our teachers and making it harder and harder for them to do their jobs. Over the last 20 years, the average weekly wages of public school teachers has decreased. Got that? Has gone down, even as wages for other college graduates has grown. In 1993, teachers made about 5% less than other workers with similar education. Today, teachers now make 21% less than people with similar education. And they now, on average, make less than the typical worker in every state. Is there any wonder why young people are not going into teaching? In America today, a third of all teachers are working a second job and running up debt just to make ends meet. So we ask them to do a great job with our children, to pay attention to every kid in the classroom, and yet so many of them have to work other jobs just to take care of their families. And with states cutting funding for schools, almost 80% of teachers report purchasing school supplies with their own money. In more and more places in America, teachers can no longer afford to live in the school districts where they teach. As a result of low pay and other inequities, 20% of teachers now leave the profession within 5 years. Think of what that means to the kids when teachers are coming in and coming out. This high rate of turnover is more pronounced in low-income communities of color and has created outrageous teacher shortages. And let me applaud and congratulate the teachers here in South Carolina and all across America, as I said earlier, who have stood up and fought back. All over this country, teachers are telling us that no, they should not have to work 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet. Their students should not have to go to overcrowded, underfunded, and dilapidated schools while billionaires get tax breaks. Teachers are making their voices heard, and let me tell you right now that when we defeat Donald Trump, and we will defeat Donald Trump, the teachers of America will be my partners in the administration that we forge. It will not be CEOs from Wall Street making educational decisions. It will be people who love the kids in this country and who support public education. And one of the first things we will do is to require states to pay teachers a solid starting salary. And that includes cost of living increases so that teachers are not priced out of their school districts. And because we believe in equal pay for equal work, we're going to make sure that we end gender disparities in teacher pay. We're going to reverse Donald Trump's plan to eliminate funding for teacher training and development, and we are instead going to invest more resources so that our kids have the best educators. In addition to investing in our teachers, we need to make new investments in our schools themselves. We need to see our schools not just as places where we warehouse children, but as places where we create an environment that is conducive to learning and that ends up being the center of our community life. And one way forward in that regard is to make sure that no child in America who goes to school is hungry. Further, as president, my administration will provide year-round free universal school meals. And we're not talking junk food here, we're talking quality food in cooperation with local farms when that is possible. And here is another issue that we are going to address, which is very dear to my heart because I've seen it work in Vermont. When we talk about education, it is not just the normal school day. What happens to the children after they leave school? What do they do at 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock? And by the way, what sociologists tell us, this is a time when kids get into trouble. So we are going to fund high-quality after-school programs all across this country. And here's something else we're going to do. We're going to fund summer programs for kids as well. You know, it boggles my mind that summertime comes while kids are after school and parents are worried about whether these kids are involved in constructive activities or something else. And we have got to address that issue. Okay, there we go.
There we go.
All right, we are prepared. Right now, for every child in an after-school program, 2 more are waiting to get in, and that is unacceptable. We will also make substantial investments in rebuilding and modernizing our crumbling schools. Can you believe that kids all across this country are going to schools which are dilapidated, in some cases do not even have clean drinking water? Donald Trump has been floating an infrastructure plan that is designed to reward his friends on Wall Street. I've got a better idea. In our administration, our infrastructure plan is going to renovate, modernize, and rebuild our schools. So let me just conclude where we are. Our current educational system is failing millions of our young people. We disrespect the people we give the most important responsibility to, and that is taking care of our kids. We give tax breaks to people who don't need them, and then we cut back on our children. So what our program is about is changing the priorities in this country with regard to education. We're going to invest in our children. We're going to invest in our teachers. We're going to invest in public education in America. And you know, this is America, and please don't tell me that we in the wealthiest nation on earth cannot have the best education from preschool to graduate school. Don't tell me we cannot afford to do that. Don't tell me we cannot get young people excited to engage in the important work of education. Don't tell me we can't rebuild our schools so that they are modern buildings with the latest technology. Don't tell me that in America we can't do that. Under my presidency, not only will we do that, but we're going to do that working together. And our goal is to make sure that the future belongs to our children, a bright future, a wonderful future, a future in which they are the best educated children in the entire world. Thank you all very much.